At a shared birthday party, my mother-in-law handed all of her grandchildren an iPhone 16 Pro Max, except my daughter. She looked me in the eye and said, "I only gave it to the real grandchildren." All I did was smile, and I already knew the next move would be mine. When Martha called to tell me she was homeless and a little pressed for time, I said, "Come on over. My name is Rachel and I work as a designer from home, and home in our case is a cozy chaos of children's drawings, order folders, and reminders on the refrigerator." My husband, Dan, was fiddling with a screwdriver that evening and said we'd manage as we always have. A few screws, a little patience, a lot of tea. We rearranged the living room to fit her rocking chair, bought a soft comforter, organized a separate shelf in the kitchen for her herbal collections, and I moved my laptop to the edge of the table where the lamp shines at an awkward angle and the cord clings to my sleeve. For the first few days, Martha held her own. She cooked soup according to our family recipe, told me how hard it was alone, and in the evening asked me to keep it down because nerves at age are not ironclad. Chloe, my daughter, ran around the house with her scrapbook as if she were a guest star who needed to be surprised. She put hand-cut cards under Martha's arm and listened to her every word as if the weather for tomorrow depended on it. I watched and thought, I wish they could make it work. In the third week, the little things that aren't little showed up. At dinner, Martha asked Liam 3 times how baseball was, then smoothly turned to Sophia what's up with theater in her class, and when Chloe unfolded a sketchbook in front of her, Martha said, "Nice," put down her spoon, and turned the conversation back to our sports victories. The word "our" sounded like a house key that wasn't handed out to everyone. I pretended not to notice, because adults sometimes choose convenient blindness to keep the evening going. But Chloe noticed. She pushed the album aside and began eating her soup as focused as if it were an exam. The next weekend we had a barbecue. A neighbor came over and Martha, beaming, introduced, "These are my grandchildren Liam and Sophia," before nodding at Chloe and adding, "And this is a girl from their school, very talented." The neighbor looked embarrassed. I asked if the girl from school would like more lemonade. Chloe said thank you in a steady voice, but later I found her on the stairs with the very same album, closed like a suitcase at the airport. I explained to Dan that such reservations were not accidental. He replied that Mom isn't always cleverly phrased, and promised to talk. The conversation turned out to be short and useless, like an instruction manual without drawings. Martha said afterward that our family has always valued discipline, and looked over her glasses at Chloe. She stopped showing new work at the table and started drawing in her room in the evenings, and I suddenly started rearranging little things. I moved Martha's chair away from the window so that she couldn't see Chloe's workstation, rearranged the tea cans in the kitchen. Not because it was important, but because I wanted to regain some control. Toward night, when the house quieted down, I caught myself listening to her footsteps. Martha liked to walk in a measured manner, as if she were running a museum and making sure no one touched the exhibits without gloves. One day she said at dinner, "Chloe, you must be a painter, because we've always had weak athletes in our family." The words were spoken calmly, but a shadow passed across the table so thick I felt it on my skin. I replied that effort of any kind was valued in our house. I didn't want a scene in front of the kids, so I opted for an almost polite pause, the kind that stretches and turns into a thick wall. Another morning, the 3 of us were getting ready for school and work. Martha detained Liam at the entrance with the phrase, "A real grandson should be able to give his coat to a lady," and Chloe, passing by, said, "You're certainly good at it too, but not every habit becomes a tradition." I stood next to her and realized that this is not an accidental roughness. It's a system. Emphasize the real, devalue the rest, and still look like a model of nurturing. A good costume on a bad idea. Chloe kept trying. She brought Martha a new card on thick paper, with small gold dots, signed in neat handwriting. "Thank you for being with us." Martha took the card, smiled, and put it on the edge of the dresser, where she usually kept the keys that no one wanted. That evening, I saw the card sliding to the floor. I picked it up, wiped the corner, and put it away, the way one hides evidence of someone in this house who loves without reservation. The more I tried to smooth it out, the more the hinges squeaked. Martha began to complain about the noise when Chloe turned on the desk lamp and the solvent smell, even though the jar had regular brush water in it. One day she sat down in her chair so that she could see everyone at once and said, "In our neighborhood, children have always known their place." Polite words, a satisfied posture, and one sentence in the middle. I smiled and asked if I could bring her some tea and honey. That evening, Chloe approached me with a sketch of a bridge going into the fog. "I'm practicing air transmission," she said. Martha moved the sheet with her elbow to set down the soup and tossed it. "You have to learn to draw the ones you really have in your family first." Chloe didn't answer. She took the sheet, folded it in half and carefully placed it in the folder. I felt the tarp of silence that sets the table after a failed dinner. I didn't scandalize. I went to the bathroom, turned on the water, and let myself watch the spray break up the foam in the soap dish for a couple minutes. When I came back, Chloe was sitting by the window, erasing the border between the fog and the railing with an eraser. I brought her a plaid and asked her if she was cold. She said she was fine and then asked, "Mom, don't you think I'm an extra here?" I replied that she was the center of our family, and that was not a figure of speech. Sometimes you have to say the obvious out loud because otherwise it will be labeled an opinion by someone else. We went to bed late. Dan tried to perk up and joked that the house could stand a couple more rearrangements. I said the house could stand it, but it didn't have to tolerate masquerading as tradition. That was the end of the evening. I didn't fall asleep right away, listening to the old thermostat clicking in the hallway, and someone's chair rocking slightly downstairs. And if you think that's the limit of tact and ridiculousness, it's not. What happened next was even more graceful and painful. What happened next changed everything. You don't want to miss how it unfolded. Martha had the idea of combining Liam, Sophia, and Chloe's birthdays into one celebration. "It's a way to show that we have a strong family," she said, and I, Rachel, didn't argue. Chloe took it as a gift. She spent her evenings laying out ribbons on the floor, writing a list of songs in her notebook, picking out the color of the garlands. She dreamed of a new phone and of Dan and I finally finishing the lamp for her. 2 weeks before the party, I overheard Martha on the phone saying, "Yeah, get the newest ones for both of them. No, not all three. There have to be boundaries." The words sounded so confident, as if she was deciding who was worthy of a seat at the table. I walked into the living room and she hit her phone and noticed the connection was fumbling. That night I ordered Chloe a set of expensive brushes and a pendant in the shape of a small tassel, a gift from us, so that there would be at least one surprise. On the day of the party, the sun hit the window so hard that the whole house sparkled. We hung garlands, inflated balloons, and set up the tables. Dan fiddled with the speakers. Chloe poured colorful candies into transparent jars. The guests came with cakes and flowers. Laughter was in every corner. Even Martha smiled as she watched Sophia help Liam fix his shirt. When the cake was brought out, the candles burned so brightly that it looked like they were going to burn through the air. We sang happy birthday and then Martha stood up. "Let's start with my presents." She gestured to Liam and Sophia and handed them 2 identical brand new smartphones. The room filled with cheers and applause. Someone was already discussing the functions of the camera. Chloe looked at the package in her hands as if it held the key to the door behind which she was waiting. "What about me?" she asked softly, but everyone heard. Martha answered coldly and clearly, "I've only given to the real grandchildren. You're not part of the family by blood." The living room became so quiet that you could hear a faucet dripping somewhere in the kitchen. Chloe silently left the room and went upstairs. I followed. She was sitting on the carpet, tearing her name tag into small pieces. "I was just asking," she said, which was worse than yelling. I sat down next to her. "Biology doesn't make a family. Love does. You are our daughter in every sense that matters." She nodded, but her eyes remained blank, like paper without a drawing. Downstairs, Dan demanded an apology from Martha. "Mom, do you realize what you just did?" His voice was taut as a string. She replied, "I told the truth. There are traditions in our family." Aunt Maria remarked, "Tradition is no excuse for humiliation," but Martha only cut her off. "Don't lecture me." Some of the guests glanced around, and a silent movement toward the door began. I went back into the living room and gathered the Polaroids. In one shot, Chloe was holding our cat in a ridiculous paper crown, and they were both laughing. I hung it on the refrigerator as a reminder that even on a bad day, you can keep something clean. Later, I noticed Martha pouring juice for Liam and Sophia at dinner, and Chloe sliding the empty glass to her, Pour your own, you're on your own. The words sounded like a small thing, but they had the same implication as that morning. After the guests left, I saw Martha in the pantry, counting the empty boxes. One from under the phone she folded neatly and put it in her bag. Symbols sometimes speak louder than words. Late that night, I stopped by Chloe's house. She was sitting at her desk painting a room. In one corner was a black rectangle. "That's a door," she said. "Is it closed?" I asked. She nodded and continued hatching. I went to bed thinking that some phrases said quietly can break louder than any shout. And what happened the next day left us no choice. I noticed Dan standing in the corner, not looking up, like he was trying to remain a shadow in his own living room. His hands were deep in his pockets and his shoulders were like a man listening to the rain but afraid to open the window. The smell of candles and cream remained in the kitchen, but in the living room there was already a silence in which one could hear one's own breathing. After the gift incident, the remaining time at the table was like a polite rehearsal of silence. Forks clinked against plates and laughter sounded delayed, as if someone had turned it on by a button. I caught Chloe's gaze as she returned for a glass of water. There was something in that look that broke the usual phrases of support, not resentment or anger, but tiredness at having to prove my place again. Martha, meanwhile, was telling Henry a story about how their family always gave symbolic gifts, but there was not an ounce of doubt in her voice that she had done the right thing. I noticed that Sophia glanced at Chloe a few times and seemed to want to say something but didn't dare. She held her new phone in her hands as if it weighed more than usual. There was some wrapping paper in the corner of the table that no one had put away. I picked it up, crumpled it up, and threw it away because I didn't want that glitter to remind me of what had happened. When everyone had dispersed, I went out into the yard. It smelled of leftover candle smoke and the cold that comes before rain. It seemed to me that even the air felt heavier that evening. Late at night, I heard Dan come down to the kitchen. He stood at the window with a cup of coffee for a long time, staring out into the darkness. I knew he was going over every word his mother said in his head too. Chloe fell asleep that night without turning off the desk lamp. Her drawing of a room with a black door lay nearby as a reminder that some doors only open from the inside. I lay awake until morning, listening to the fine rain pounding on the roof. Sometimes nature has a way of voicing what we feel but don't say. The next morning, gathering mugs in the kitchen after yesterday's meal, I saw a small piece of foil from a candy bar on the windowsill. Chloe hadn't even touched the sweet that she loved so much yesterday. I walked up to her room. The door was ajar. She was sitting in an armchair, leafing through an album of photos. Some of the pages were blank, the ones that should have been holiday pictures, which she didn't have. Martha came down later than everyone else, poured herself a cup of coffee, and asked as if nothing had happened, "So is everyone happy?" I replied, "No, Martha. Not everybody." And that was the first time I'd ever told her that directly. It's times like that that you realize that the truth is rarely loud. Sometimes it's quiet, but it's enough to move the walls in the house you live in. After that evening, it was as if the house had changed temperature. Not physically, the heating was working as usual, but emotionally. Cold began to spill into the rooms, as if someone had forgotten to close the door in January. Martha tried to act as if nothing had happened. At breakfast, she talked about the weather and gas prices, and I counted how many seconds I could go without saying a word to her. Dan was withdrawn too, but I could hear more anger in his silence than I could in mine. Chloe stayed in her room all morning. When I came in, she was going through a box of cards she'd made for Martha over the past 2 years. Little brightly colored cards with neat letters and stickers. She held up one that said, "Thank you for everything," and said quietly, "I guess I must have kept them all for nothing." Dan came home from work early and suggested that the three of us talk. I knew it would be like negotiating with someone who doesn't think he did anything wrong. Martha sat in her chair with her foot on her leg, like in an interrogation where she's the interrogator. Dan began, "Mom, you humiliated Chloe in front of everyone." She shrugged. "I told the truth. I don't see the problem." I didn't hold back. "The problem is that your truth destroys people." Martha snorted. "You're too sensitive. In our time, no one would say a word because of something like that." I replied, "People did stupid things in your time too, but that doesn't mean they should be repeated." Dan interjected, "Mom, we can't go on living like this." Her gaze became sharp. "This is my house too. I reminded, "No, Martha. This is our home. You moved here because you said you were having difficulties." The difficulties, as it turned out, were very selective. A couple days ago, I found a check for $2,500 for phones. This was the very amount that supposedly made it impossible for her to live alone. When I mentioned it, Martha lifted her chin. "It's my money, I can spend it however I want." The conversation went in circles. Every attempt to get through to her hit a concrete wall of biology and traditions. Chloe went into the kitchen, heard Martha's last words and came back out without even looking at us. I realized we'd lost another piece of trust. That night I spent a long time washing dishes, even though the sink was almost empty. Dan stood next to me and dried the plates. We hadn't explicitly discussed what to do, but we both realized something had to change, and fast. When he put the last plate in the cupboard, there was a solution in his gaze that I could already see in my head. Martha went upstairs to her room, closing the door loudly. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the cozy silence of the holiday, but the silence where you could hear the crumbling of what we called family. I stopped by Chloe's room before bed. She was lying in bed looking up at the ceiling. "Mom, if she leaves, will it be because of me?" she asked. I replied, "No, it will be because of her. We chose you. We wanted you." She nodded, and this time there was something other than emptiness in her eyes. Before I went to bed, I looked out the window. There was an owl perched on a branch in the yard, its eyes glittering in the darkness. Sometimes in life it all comes down to one moment, when you have to stop waiting for change and become that change yourself. In the kitchen, I caught myself looking for Martha's old mug with my eyes. I wanted to put it away so it wouldn't remind me of the conversation. Then I realized it had nothing to do with the mug, but I moved it to the top shelf anyway. In the evening, when everyone went to their rooms, I heard Chloe singing quietly to herself. The song was about a house where people were always welcome. I stood in the hallway and listened to the last line. Sometimes the walls of the house seemed to absorb the words. I hoped that our house remembered not only what Martha had said yesterday, but all the good things we had experienced here. The next day Martha appeared in the kitchen, as if she had stepped out of an old black and white movie where the heroine is convinced that the whole world revolves around her cup of coffee. She asked if we were going to stop at the supermarket. I replied that we had everything. In fact, we were running out of milk, but I wasn't going to drag her along. Dan walked around the house all day like a man who'd forgotten why he'd come into the room. He'd go up to Chloe's house or down to the garage, where he was fiddling with boxes that should have been thrown out a long time ago. I realized he was looking for a way to keep his hands busy, so he wouldn't say something he'd regret later. Chloe was drawing on the kitchen table, laying out her pencils the way a surgeon lays out his instruments. She worked in silence, only occasionally looking up if Dan or I came into the room. When Martha came in, Chloe didn't take her eyes off the sheet. In the evening at dinner, Martha started talking about proper parenting again. She said that children needed to understand their place. And I almost laughed. It sounded so absurd when you were sitting at the same table with those you had divided into your own and strangers. Dan put down his fork and said, "Mom, that's enough." His voice was quiet, but there was more power in it than any shout. Martha replied that he was being overdramatic. I noticed Chloe stopped eating and just stared at her plate. After dinner, I went out into the yard to exhale. The sky was as thick as spilled coffee and there wasn't a single star in it. I thought about how sometimes family isn't who you share the same blood with, but who you can look up into the dark sky with and not feel alone. Later that evening, when Martha was already in her room, I went into Dan's office. We sat in silence and he said, "I can't take it anymore." Those were the most honest words I'd heard in days. During the night, I woke up to hear footsteps. It was Chloe. She was quietly walking to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I met her in the hallway. We just nodded at each other. Sometimes that's enough. Before dawn, I lay there listening to the floorboards creaking in the house. Every sound seemed to be part of the conversation we kept putting off, but which was already inevitable. In the morning there was silence in the house, which was not broken even by the noise of the kettle. Chloe came into the kitchen in a sweater that was too big for her, and asked if she could go for a walk. Dan and I looked at each other and agreed without words. On the way to the park, the three of us walked, but each of us was in our own thoughts. The leaves under our feet rustled as if they were trying to fill the void of conversation. In the park, Chloe stopped by the pond and looked at the water for a long time. I walked over and told her that things were going to change. She replied, I just want it to be peaceful at home. Dan put his hand on her shoulder and nodded. Sometimes one movement said more than an hour of explanation.